Welcome back, everybody. We are coming off of a week with the topics that were kind of a downer, and hopefully this week will be a little nicer to us. So last week we looked at human impacts of marine ecosystems. So as you saw, most of those impacts were negative. Um, Humans are one of the most important organisms that change their surrounding areas. Other organisms do this. Elephants are well known for bulldozing trees and changing the savannas of Africa and also in India. Um, and lots of organisms affect their natural world. Beavers build dams, which change the flow of rivers that can impact lots of different organisms. But humans are unique in that we do it on a gigantic scale. So that being said, looking at all of those negative aspects, it's not all bad. Humans have learned that our actions have consequences, and we are, in general, trying to fix a lot of those. Um, the In terms of things like climate change, cars are the most efficient that they've ever been. We Europe is on track to be completely rid of fossil fuels in terms of power production by the end of the decade. And in fact, it was just reported in the or this week that Sweden has actually completely divested itself of fossil fuels for power production, and that is 3 years early than they were expecting. So good for Sweden. It is possible to go to these, and contrary to what you might think, the biggest contributors to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere aren't individuals. It's factories, it's power production, it's all these large industries, not necessarily individuals. Individuals in a as a whole do give a large proportion of it, but that's one of the good things is we've figured out how to fix some of these problems, and that's what we're going to be looking at this week. We are looking at marine conservation and ecotourism. We're going to look at ecotourism in a little bit more detail. You're actually going to do a little project on it here next week. So that will be your assignment for next week. But for now, we're going to look at conservation, marine conservation, what it is, what are some things that we do, and then we're going to look at ecotourism. All right, so let's start. So, like we said, conservation sounds, you have probably heard this term thousands and thousands of times. But for our purposes, it is the protection and preservation of natural resources and the environment. So, not only keeping them how they are for now, but also keeping them how they are in the future. So the biggest reasons why is to conserve a range of habitats so they're not lost as a result of pressures from human populations. That's why a lot of new um, development has sets aside conservation areas that they don't touch, and you'll see this a lot in a lot of planned communities. And to encourage biodiversity in a range of habitats. If you have the biodiversity, you will likely have a reasonably functioning ecosystem. Um, we can conserve whole environments, so whole ecosystems, but we can also conserve individual species. So you may have probably heard of the Endangered Species Act from the 1970s, and organisms are added to the endangered species list. They are removed from the endangered species list. That act is only in the United States. There is a worldwide um, movement for uh, endangered species, but Endangered Species Act is specifically U.S. So conservation of sea turtles. It is all marine reptiles are protected, so that's sea turtles pretty much for us. And all marine mammals are protected, so that's whales, dolphins, sea lions, seals, any of those things, or things like whale sharks. Those are all part of conservation. A success story is this little guy, a West Indian manatee. So they were hunted for food. They were killed just because they sort of float around like a big potato. And the manatee, um, after years and years of conservation, is actually increased its number so that it is now off the endangered species list. It is still protected because it's a marine mammal, but it is no longer endangered, which is a great thing. So why do we want to do conservation? The biggest thing is to maintain species diversity. So this isn't necessarily just maintaining diversity for the sake of diversity. Sometimes there's actually, and some people need this, there's an economic benefit to maintaining species diversity because there are a lot of economically important organisms in fisheries, and by maintaining the ecosystems that those economically important organisms live in, we can ensure that those economically important organisms will have the food, will have the um, food chain that they need to survive. So, how do we go about this? Things like fisheries management, which we've looked at. So, all the stuff with fisheries management, that's more on the economic side. Giving organisms protected status, so like the Endangered Species Act, declaring something an endangered species, prevents lots of harvest of the organisms. It also allows the more fines if you violate it, that sort of thing. And then habitat protection. So this can be achieved by lots of things. There's what are called marine protected areas, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. National parks are a great example of habitat protection. State parks, all of that. That's all habitat protection. The Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. Wildlife refuges are habitat protection. These are places where it is generally um, undeveloped and allows these organisms to live as they would without human intervention. But on the other end, a lot of this conservation effort can have negative socioeconomic effects. So if you put a giant marine protected area around a particular place, then it may be more difficult or even illegal for people who previously relied on fish or whatever sea life to survive now aren't able to. So we have this idea of what's called a stakeholder. So a stakeholder is anybody who has a interest in what's happening in a particular area. That could be someone who lives there. That could be business owners, scientists, people trying to do the conservation. All of that um, is important. So we have to take that into consideration too. So here's some examples. A great example of why we need conservation is in the North Sea fishery. So the North Sea is a body of water between the island of Great Britain and the Scandinavian peninsula, which has Norway and Sweden on it. So it's that body of water which separates them. And in the North Sea, there was a huge codfish fishery. But because of overfishing by the British, by the Norwegians, by the Danes, by the Swedes, all of them were now at about a tenth of the original size of the codfish population. Because of this, these are an economically important organism. It's important that we uh, increase this fishery because we won't have any codfish in this part of the world left. But because of the extreme overfishing, it is actually possible that uh, even if we completely banned fishing and did everything that we possibly could with cod in the North Sea, they may not be able to recover. Um, so even if we do everything, the codfish in the North Sea might not be able to survive. But we need to try because otherwise we're guaranteed not to have any. Um, when you remove an organism from a food chain, it causes what's called a trophic cascade. So essentially, it's like the dominoes falling. So if you remove a top level predator like a tuna, tuna are a great example of an organism that needs conservation. So if you remove a top level predator like a tuna, that means that whatever the tuna eats, their numbers are going to increase. But whatever they eat, the things that the tuna eats, whatever they eat, the numbers are going to decrease, and then it's going to flip flop like that all the way down the food chain until we get to the bottom. And hopefully, there's enough rungs in the chain that they will be able to survive, or there's enough alternative food sources. Otherwise, that could cause the entire food chain to collapse, and we're gonna have a bad time. All right, so what does successful conservation look like? So we have to know about the area, about the organism, about if we're talking about a single species, we have to know what it eats, when it's active, what its age of fecundity is. This may all look very familiar to you when we talk about, we need to know about its ecological niche, and we need to know all about the data that we collected in the fisheries management section. So this is all coming together here. We have to understand why some species and habitats are more vulnerable than others. So there are lots of organisms that, and lots of ecological areas that humans have impeded on, and they're doing fine. Whereas others just completely collapse anytime a human even glances over at the place. So without all of this information, we won't be able to do any conservation, which is why scientific study of these ecosystems is super important. Another example of what we actually do in terms of conservation is marine protected areas. So these are areas which would include parts of the ocean. It could be like large lakes, could be small lakes, could be any sort of body of water where certain activities such as fishing are controlled to protect species. And there's like a definition of stakeholders there. So it's a person or group with an interest in a particular area. So when it comes to the Indian River Lagoon, you are all stakeholders because you live in the Indian River Lagoon area. A lot of you go fishing there. A lot of you will go on a boat. A lot of you will, whether you know it or not, be eating food from there. It's all very important, and even if you're not directly using the Indian River Lagoon, there are people coming here for tourism for the Indian River Lagoon, which helps with tax money and bringing all that stuff in. So um, you are a stakeholder there. Marine protected areas, we'll look at those. One thing to notice about this map. So this map shows the marine protected areas in the United States. And so the yellow is marine protected areas. Um, and then that sort of like grayish color, those are the U.S. exclusive economic zone. Those are what we call U.S. waters. So what that means is no one but the United States is allowed to use those waters for any sort of economic purpose. So essentially fishing. So those belong to the United States. Organizations and governments and things can have treaties that allow us to use the exclusive economic zones, but in general, that's just us. A good example of where countries share exclusive economic zones is right here. So codfish are very popular are right here in Canada, but just north of the United States. So the U.S. and Canada have a treaty that allows both countries to fish here. But back to marine protected areas. Um, so one thing you may notice about the marine protected areas in the United States is it is essentially all coastal waters in the United States are marine protected areas. And that's true. So remember, that does not mean that you cannot fish in the coastal waters of the United States, but that just means, if we go back to the definition, where certain activities such as fishing are controlled to protect species. So we have all of those fisheries management techniques. Those are all happening in the United States in the marine protected areas. So essentially, this means that the United States is allowed to put regulations on these marine protected areas, which they do. Most of the time, it's controlled by the individual states, but there are some regulations by the United States Fish and Wildlife group. So, a great example of another type of conservation is things like national seashores and national parks. So, Canaveral National Seashore is one of them. So, here's just some pretty pictures. Oh, that's nice. Okay, so switching gears a little bit now, we're going to be looking at ecotourism. You're actually going to be looking at ecotourism a little bit more detail next week. This is going to be a 2-week unit instead of a 1-week unit. Sometimes you will see it called ecological tourism. And so it's tourism that involves all, or at least the most of, if some of them may not apply, of the characteristics that you see there. So ecotourism is not just plopping down a hotel in the middle of a protected area and saying, "Here you go." No, it has to be travel to natural destinations, including fragile and protected areas. The biggest thing, it has to have a low impact on the area. So there have to be, when we say low impact, that means it uses minimal water, it uses minimal land, it disrupts the natural area in a minimal way. So it has to have clean energy to power whatever it is that you're doing. This could be a hotel, but it has to follow all of these things. There has to be education for the traveler, funds for local conservation. So at least part of the mission of the ecotourism facility has to be giving funds for local conservation and local economic development. We'll talk about that one in just a second. And then encouraging respect for different cultures, which is important. So one of the reasons why ecotourism is so popular nowadays is it tries to reduce the impact or increase the sustainability of tourism. Flying in an airplane uses a ton of carbon because of jet fuel. Jet fuel is essentially just kerosene with some additives. So that produces a lot of carbon. So we want to reduce that by by conserving energy in ways while you're there, a focus on recycling, use of sustainable resources, and it also, as we said, it should help sponsor conservation projects. But looking at, if we go back, looking at this benefiting the local economic development, ecotourism resorts frequently are owned by large hotel conglomerates, and so instead of the money staying in the local area, which is one of the tenets of ecotourism, what can happen is this money gets sent off to New York City or to Los Angeles or to Miami or wherever the hotel chain is based. So if we want to do real ecotourism, we have to make sure that there is money reinvested in the local economy or into local conservation products. So it should employ local people and the money should stay mostly in that area. So that's it. This is a short one. Next week you will get a little project to do. So I will talk to you later. Hopefully everybody's doing all right. If you're not, or if you just want to say hi, say hi. All right. So we'll see you later.